Hey everybody, and welcome back to Sip and Talk.
We've got quite a mix of information to unpack today. We're looking at some major global shifts.
Absolutely. From trade tensions heating up again to some really serious developments in the Ukraine conflict, and even something, well, unexpected about who's listening.
Right.
We'll start with the latest on tariffs, always a source of market jitters.
Mm-hmm.
Then we'll move to Ukraine and Russia, including some, frankly, chilling discussions around nuclear possibilities.
And definitely stick around for that last piece. It's a weird little data point that just popped up, but it might actually tie back into these bigger global currents.
It's pretty intriguing.
Yeah. Okay, so tariffs. Feels like we're always talking about tariffs, doesn't it? The uncertainty just lingers.
It really does. And what's interesting here is some analysis suggesting maybe the full impact of old policies didn't quite land as expected. Maybe because stances kept shifting.
But they're definitely having an effect now, right?
Oh, for sure. There are concrete examples. Like a 10% tariff on European cars.
Yeah.
Apparently, that one's seen as pretty effective.
Okay. And then the big one, recently doubling the tariffs on steel and aluminum. Up to 50%.
Yeah, 50. That's a huge jump. And the immediate hit is on manufacturers right here. Anyone using imported steel, aluminum. Their costs just went way up.
Which eventually could mean higher prices for consumers down the line.
Exactly. Production costs rise. That often gets passed on.
And meanwhile, those US-EU trade talks are still grinding along. The info we have suggests, if they don't find common ground, we could see retaliatory tariffs.
It feels like a constant low simmer, doesn't it? Just below the surface.
Yeah. And then bringing it home, inside the U.S., there's this whole debate about a major tax bill.
Mm-hmm.
The CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, they put out a report.
Right, the nonpartisan scorekeeper. And their take, it could add something like $2.42 trillion to the deficit over the next decade.
Wow. $2.4 trillion. That number just jumps out. Especially when you sometimes hear the argument that, tariff money could help the deficit.
Well, yeah, but this CBO report shows how other things in the bill, like, say, making temporary tax cuts permanent or fiddling with the SALT cap, the state and local tax deduction, those could easily swamp any revenue from tariffs.
So it's a really tangled fiscal picture. Spending cuts, tax rules, trade policy, it all interacts.
Absolutely. It's never just one thing in isolation.
And looking outward again, how are allies reacting? Canada, for example. Alberta's premier was apparently in D.C. recently.
And the message was pretty blunt. They see these tariffs as punitive, like they're being punished. There's specific confusion mentioned about the aluminum tariff, like why?
That confusion piece is interesting. It suggests maybe the rationale isn't clear or isn't being accepted, which just strains things further.
Right. And what's Canada doing? Trying to renegotiate USMCA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement to get back to tariff-free trade.
Makes sense.
But also, because of this uncertainty with the U.S., they're looking inward, strengthening trade between Canadian provinces, and also looking outward, new markets, Asia, Europe.
Diversifying. If your biggest neighbor keeps throwing up walls, you look for other doors. It shows how these policies force strategic shifts everywhere.
Definitely. Then there's the big one, China. Always complicated. We're seeing comments from U.S. officials, Treasury Secretary, for instance, pointing fingers at imbalances in China's economy.
What kind of imbalances?
The message is basically China needs to boost its own domestic consumption, get a handle on deflation, and stop kind of exporting its excess production capacity onto the world market at low prices.
Okay. I remember there was that sort of truce agreed in Geneva. Tariffs came down a bit. U.S. from like 145% to 30%. China down to 10%.
But that was fragile. And it had a 90-day clock, which runs out around early July. So there's a lot of nervousness in the markets about what happens next. Will tariffs snap back up?
And underlying it all seems to be this deep distrust on both sides.
Totally. The market seems desperate for any sign, like maybe a phone call between President Trump and Xi Jinping, just for some clarity.
There was even that specific detail about China maybe thinking about buying a load of Airbus planes.
Yeah, using a big commercial deal as like a diplomatic signal.
Yeah.
Showing willingness to talk, maybe. It's fascinating how trade and geopolitics get tangled.
But that issue with rare earths, China restricting exports, that's still a major sticking point, it seems.
Well, huge. Rare earths are critical for so much tech. And what's also noted is that Chinese companies seem, well, maybe more prepared this time around.
How so?
They've been through this before. So they've apparently been working on diversifying their supply chains, not being so reliant on the U.S. market, and focusing more on selling to their own huge domestic market.
Smart adaptation, I guess. We also saw some notes on recent comments from President Trump about Xi, saying a call was very likely soon, but also that it's hard to make a deal.
Right. And he specifically accused China of breaking the previous agreement, especially on those rare earth limits.
It just highlights the tension. And this isn't happening in a vacuum, right? There was mention of that January 17th call, too, focused on preventing war, ensuring peace, alongside other issues like fentanyl. It's all connected.
Exactly. Trade, security, domestic issues. They all bleed into each other on the international stage.
So, stepping back even further, the overall global economic outlook presented here, it's not exactly rosy, is it? Expectation seems to be for pretty low growth for decades, barring any big crises.
Yes, sluggish growth. And a big reason cited is precisely this tariff and trade uncertainty. It just chills long-term investment. Businesses hate uncertainty.
Plus, there's mention of the high U.S. deficit being unsustainable, concerns about governance quality declining.
Even questions about the dollar's long-term status as the world's reserve currency. That's a fundamental pillar potentially being shaken. And more global government debt, more bonds being issued, that could push up interest rates globally.
But it's not all doom and gloom. There was a mention of resilience in private capital markets.
Yeah, particularly private credit seems robust. And interestingly, some investors are apparently starting to see European assets as, like, a relative safe haven compared to the U.S. right now. A bit of a shift.
And it makes sense that the service sector is less hit by goods tariffs. Hard to tax a consulting gig crossing the border.
True. Now, shifting to specific industries, China's push in AI-driven humanoid robots really jumped out. Massive state investment there.
Directly challenging traditional U.S. tech strengths.
Definitely. But what's also highlighted is that actually for this industry to really advance things like AI modeling, complex supply chains, some U.S.-China cooperation is still kind of crucial.
So competition, but also interdependence. What industries are we talking about here?
Manufacturing, electronics, semiconductors, obviously, new energy, defense, and these humanoid robots, or embodied AI.
And the U.S. and Taiwan still have key advantages, right? Especially in those super high-end chips.
For sure. Cutting-edge semiconductors, certain components. The U.S. and Taiwan are still leaders. But China's drive, fueled by huge subsidies like Guangdong province alone apparently throwing $140 billion at it, creates intense competition.
Which brings us back to that point about allies. The overall perspective seems to be that these U.S. tariff policies, whatever their intent, have caused real unease and distrust among partners.
Yeah, the argument is basically this isn't helping relationships, it's having negative economic impacts on friends, and maybe there are ways to be tough on adversaries without alienating your allies.
It's a tough balancing act. Okay, let's make a shift now from economics to the much grimmer reality of conflict. Ukraine and Russia, we've touched on the spiderweb idea before.
Yes, the concept of Ukraine developing the ability to strike targets deep inside Russia. And the main takeaway now is they've shown they can do it significantly with drones.
And the timing is key here, according to the analysis. It looks like Ukraine might have been holding back, maybe hoping for peace talks, perhaps involving President Trump even.
But as those hopes faded, 4 months into a second Trump term with no quick end to the war in sight, they seem to have decided to act. This lack of diplomatic progress looks directly linked to unleashing something like this spiderweb operation.
It signals a major shift in their strategy and their capability, particularly with drones, reaching far beyond the front lines.
And the specifics on that operation, June 1st, 2025, they're pretty stark. A huge coordinated drone attack, hitting multiple air bases, even one way out in Siberia, Belaya.
The scale, 117 drones mentioned, planned for 18 months.
That's what's reported. And the impact claimed is massive, destroying or damaging really high-value Russian assets, strategic bombers.
The number cited was, 34% of Russia's air-to-air missile carriers potentially knocked out or damaged in one go?
If that number holds up, it's a staggering blow to their air power. And it just screams cost-effectiveness, doesn't it? A swarm of drones versus incredibly expensive, complex bombers.
There was also that note about Ukraine apparently not giving the Trump administration a heads up beforehand.
Which is being interpreted by some as maybe Ukraine feeling less reliant on U.S. mediation. Or perhaps frustrated that the promised quick peace deal just wasn't happening.
Yeah, the war grinds on. And that June 4th call mentioned between Trump and Putin reportedly showed continued tension. Putin warning of a response? Peace still seems far off.
So the analysis suggests this operation came from that frustration. Lack of diplomatic movement plus ongoing Russian attacks.
It feels like a potential turning point, but a risky one.
Extremely risky. Because hitting assets like strategic bombers, those can potentially carry nuclear weapons. That automatically raises the stakes and fears of Russian escalation.
It really shows how drone warfare is changing things, making even heavily defended high-value targets vulnerable in new ways.
Definitely a new era. So the impact, well, it could boost Ukrainian morale, show capability to allies, maybe encourage more support.
But the flip side is huge. Putin's response. Could it intensify the war? Could it push things closer to that nuclear threshold everyone fears?
And that leads us directly into the heaviest part of this material, the discussion about actually using nuclear weapons. The assessment is blunt. It would change everything. Devastating doesn't even begin to cover it.
The descriptions are just hard to comprehend. Immediate effects. Blast, heat, radiation, cities gone, millions dead in minutes.
And then the long term. Yeah. Radioactive fallout spreading for potentially thousands of miles. And this concept of nuclear winter.
Right, the idea that massive amounts of soot kicked up into the atmosphere would block sunlight, drastically cool the planet, cause global crop failures, potentially leading to famine, threatening up to 2 billion people, ecosystems collapsing worldwide.
There was a simulation mentioned, U.S.-Russia using 4,400 relatively small 100-kiloton weapons. The resulting soot would trigger a global food catastrophe. It drives home that the impact isn't just local, it's global, potentially civilization ending.
And legally. Using them is considered a war crime, right? A violation of international humanitarian law.
Overwhelmingly so. There's the 2021 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, TPNW. It bans their use entirely. Now, nuclear states haven't signed it, but...
But the international consensus is clear.
Yes. And the International Court of Justice, back in '96, said the threat or use generally violates international law. Even if they left a tiny crack open for some hypothetical extreme survival scenario, the general prohibition is strong.
And given the long-term devastation to civilians, the environment, it could easily be classed as a crime against humanity, too.
Absolutely. Of course, there's still the huge debate. Nuclear powers argue they're purely for deterrence, to prevent conventional war between major powers.
While non-nuclear states argue their very existence raises the risk, accidentally or deliberately, and undermines security for everyone, the UN keeps calling for total elimination as the only real safeguard.
It's, incredibly sobering to think about these possibilities laid out so starkly.
It really is. From the seemingly mundane details of tariff percentages impacting manufacturers to these deep strikes in Ukraine and then this ultimate horrifying potential outcome.
It just underscores how interconnected everything is and how high the stakes are right now.
Which, believe it or not, brings us to that final unexpected piece of information. The curious case of the Spanish listeners.
Yeah, this was definitely a curveball. A sudden, really noticeable jump in listeners from Spain. The back-end data for our Spanish audience has been skyrocketing.
Right. Totally seems out of left field after discussing nuclear war and trade deficits.
I was already curious last time what's bringing you all here. Let's take a guess. One thought is, maybe it's tied directly to how these big global events are hitting Spain. Like the Ukraine war messing with energy prices in Europe, including Spain.
Or the U.S.-China trade tensions impacting the whole EU market, making Spain look for its own path, maybe balancing relationships. That mention of Prime Minister Sanchez visiting China back in April fits here.
So the idea is maybe people in Spain are actively seeking out more geopolitical context because these distant events are actually having very real effects on their lives, their economy.
You know, international intervention in conflicts, ideological battles, outside powers backing different sides. Does that resonate with Spain's own history? Like the Civil War?
That's a fascinating thought. History leaves deep marks.
Maybe listeners there appreciate discussions that connect the dots between geopolitics and deeper questions about power, ethics, global order.
Could be.
Hey, why the sudden interest? What brought you here?
It's like a little real-time mystery unfolding in the audience data, reflecting these huge global shifts in an unexpected way.
So, wrapping up this deep dive, we've waded through the murky waters of global trade, tariffs, the impacts on allies, the economic outlook.
The America First tariff policy has caused unease, distrust, and even economic harm among allies. This isn't what we want to see. Once again, we urge Trump to consider our allies. You can take on enemies, not friends. We hope negotiations lead to positive outcomes. Don't push allies away from the U.S. We need these partners.
It's complex, uncertain.
We've looked hard at the escalating war in Ukraine, that demonstrated new capabilities and the terrifying shadow of potential nuclear conflict that hangs over it all.
And we ended on this surprising note about listeners in Spain, a small reminder of how interconnected we all are, how global events ripple outwards in ways we might not even expect.
All drawn from the information we explored together today.
So here's a thought to leave you with. How are these global currents, whether it's an economic policy decision made continents away, or a conflict unfolding far from your home, how might they be subtly shaping your world, your choices, maybe even what you choose to pay attention to? Thinking about those connections feels, well, pretty crucial right now.
It really does.
And hey, if you enjoyed this deep dive, you know what to do. Subscribe to Sip and Talk wherever you get your podcasts.
Yeah, and don't forget to check out our buddy Micky's YouTube channel. Always has some fun stuff going on over there.